Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. And sorry we started a little late because the panelists were here, but some of you were, I think, taking a round of the campus, so welcome. My name is Manoj Chakravarti, and I head the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship as its COO. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have come here today for a panel discussion on whether India needs an independent monetary policy and a debt management policy separated from the Reserve Bank of India. Our center is overseen by an advisory committee, and its chairperson is Professor S. Raghunath, Professor of Strategy at IIM Bangalore, who is amidst us today. And I'm now going to hand over the proceedings to him to introduce the panel members. So without further ado, I once again welcome you all and hand over to Professor Raghunath to take the proceedings further. Post the discussions, please stay back for a cup of coffee and high tea to accelerate our cerebral thought process. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the effort, the time to get into our campus. I know we are not a location that you can easily reach, so thank you very much for the effort. We have a very interesting panel, as you note from your program details. We have the member of our Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Bhalla. We have Mr. Bhattacharya, who was earlier our Chief Secretary of the Government of Karnataka, and also the chairperson for the Committee on Pension Reforms. We have Dr. Narendra Pani. Most of you must have either met him or read what he did. He was the resident editor of Economic Times, though he was also a professor at IIM Bangalore many years ago. And we have a very rich set of ideas relating to the theme. We will first begin with Dr. Bhalla, and he is primarily going to address us on the independence of monetary policy and the functioning of the center.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this. And monetary policy is something that I have worked on and dealt with for the last 30, 40 years. Indeed, the first book of that I was involved in was called The Transmission of Inflation to Developing Economies, something that is referred to by Charan Singh in his book. So this is a subject matter that is of dear interest to me. Now, there are two aspects about monetary policy that I will talk about. And I will, the first aspect being the efficacy of monetary policy, and related to that, what are the determinants? How does money or knowledge about money supply, etc., monetary policy affect important variable, or the most important variable, which is inflation? There's also, of course, the belief that monetary policy affects growth, but that's not so controversial. What is controversial is, does monetary policy actually affect inflation? Now, in India, we just brought in the inflation targeting in 2016, October. And there is a hypothesis, and perhaps one can get into it later, that we brought in inflation targeting after the horse had left the stable. In other words, when we no longer needed inflation targeting, we brought in inflation targeting. Indeed, the first country to bring in inflation targeting was New Zealand back in 1986, I believe. And New Zealand, just a few months ago, gave up on the entire idea of inflation targeting. So while we are starting on it, on inflation, there are two variables that are often attributed to inflation. One is money supply growth, and the other is fiscal deficits. Again, two subjects or two relationships that I examined quite thoroughly in Charan Singh's book. And let's look at the evidence on that. And I sort of have an open challenge to anybody to show me for any country, okay, over any reasonable period of time, whether the fiscal deficit is associated with inflation. So if you have knowledge of the fiscal deficit of an economy, and here, we constantly, our RBI constantly talks about fiscal deficits and so on and so forth. The rest of the world has gotten a bit soft on relating fiscal deficits to inflation, precisely because they have failed to find any relationship between them. But the IMF clearly makes it a case of mentioning that fiscal deficits are going up, and therefore you have. And empirical tests have been done on this, and really it's very, very difficult to find any relationship whatsoever. One of the interesting, back in, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, the RBI published an article where they said that because of loan waivers, fiscal deficit will increase. The consolidated central fiscal deficit will increase by 100 basis points, and that will cause a 50 basis point increase in inflation. Okay. So this is an academic article which they cite in the Monetary Policy Report, et cetera. And the time period that they take for this is between 96 and 2014. Now, and it's quarterly data. Now we have, and a curious question arises, we have data, quarterly data from 1996. Anybody who's worked with quarterly data knows that we have, from 1996 onwards, quarterly data. And so the question arises, why didn't the RBI use that piece of evidence? They only started their analysis from 2006 to 2014. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, on the way to the analysis, is that if you take even 1 year prior, if the RBI in their econometric model had even taken data from 2005, they would have lost the statistical significance on the fiscal deficit. And if you go all the way back to 96, it just is no relationship between fiscal deficits and inflation for India. Okay. So one, I think, the empirical evidence is rather strong that fiscal deficits don't have much to do with inflation. You may not want fiscal deficits. I, for one, do not want fiscal deficits because the government is involved, and the government, by any day of the week or month or year, I would take a private sector decision-making process rather than a government decision. So I think there are good reasons to oppose fiscal deficits, but not the academic reason normally cited that this will lead to inflation. I would end with, there is an interesting chapter on debt management and whether the debt management should be part and parcel of the RBI, which it is. Now, so the chapter document, so there's a lot of discussion about, debt management, whether it is helps in the independence of monetary policy or it doesn't, and if you will, what has been other countries' experience with having debt management as part of the central bank. So it's the central bank is, if the central bank does debt management, it's, it does the crime, it does the policing, it does the execution, it does the judgment. So you're setting interest rates and you're also borrowing and setting up the debt management strategy. Now, the curious thing I want to leave you with is that there are, I think, 14 reports, 14, count them, that India has had since 92, 93, or maybe a few years prior to that, on debt management in India. And these reports have all recommended that there should be an independent debt management office, independent of the central bank, including some real luminaries, and I mean luminaries in an important sense, really very, very, some of the brightest central bank governors that we've had, Y.V. Reddy, a very bright deputy governor, Rakesh Mohan, and then you have Raghuram Rajan, And the curious thing is that they all opposed, or they all proposed, that debt management should be housed outside of the central bank. And the funny thing is, once they became central bank officials, they all proposed that, no, 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 that's a terrible idea. It should be housed within the RBI. So I don't know what happens in the gates of the RBI, but that's a reality that we face. So I want to end with that we are one of the very few countries in the world that, one of the very few important countries, that may be the only country, that has the debt management office within the central bank, and with the central bank having complete authority to determine interest rates and to determine the structure of your borrowing, which is what debt management is. So it's something for us to think about when we examine why it is that such an important function is left to the RBI, when its own proponents have said it should be moved out, except for the days when they were in the RBI, and that is the decision that we have to stay with. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
When I was requested to come and join this panel, I shouldn't say that I had some hesitation, but I had to make it very clear up front that I'm neither a doctor, I don't have any PhD, I'm not an economist, though more than 50 years ago I studied economics, I taught economics. I am a quintessential generalist administrator. I am not diffident of saying that I'm not a specialist, but I'm a generalist. I'm like ordinary citizen of India who had some exposure to some aspects of fiscal administration of this country. And with that background, I'm going to talk a little bit on this subject of debt management and related issues, which, though it is a part of overall fiscal management, it has impact, or it impinges on monetary policy, and also combined effect of monetary policy and fiscal policy has its effect on macro policy. I'd like to talk a bit on those aspects. I'd like to add a little more, if you permit me, that my first exposure to public debt, except that as a student I have read, and also when I started teaching postgraduate class in the economics department, as a young lecturer, I was assigned the subject of public finance and statistics. So that time I had some exposure to public finance, including public debt, and we used to depend heavily on Musgrave's book on public finance. That was my first exposure to debt. Then in the process of bureaucratic posting in Delhi, I was posted in an organization which was a very obscure organization until Professor Surjit Bhalla highlighted that organization to prove that there has been employment generation in the country in the last 4 years. I was the head of the Employees Provident Fund organization, which has been providing data regarding new job creation, if I may say so, in the organized sector, based upon which Professor Bhalla has been writing about the employment generation. At that time also, because of strict control of the finance ministry and the other labor ministry on investment of the employees' provident funds, large amount of our funds used to be invested in government securities, state government securities, central government securities, plus some special deposit accounts in the banks and all that. That was further exposure to the bond market. But I didn't know much about the nitty-gritty of how the bond market functions, but I knew that our provident fund, or rather employees' social security fund, gets invested in the bond market. Later on, after retirement, when I had an opportunity to head the pension reforms committee set up by the government of India, though many of our recommendations were not fully accepted by the government of India, as normally they should not. But some recommendations regarding the investment pattern of the pension fund to be controlled by the Pension Fund Regulatory Development Authority that have been accepted. That also talks about investment in the bond market and with some window given to investment equity, et cetera, et cetera. As a finance secretary of the state government, of course, we were floating state government bonds. My only contribution was, and the Reserve Bank of India used to take care of everything, whether it is Bihar government bonds or Karnataka government bonds. Karnataka government used to claim at that time, even Reserve Bank of India also accepted that we are one of the better fiscally managed states. But let us say some other state which is not so well managed. Reserve Bank of India will ensure that all the bonds are picked up by the commercial banks. They used to just make some phone calls and all that. It is to be picked up. There is no problem of selling those bonds. Later on, I find now Government of India's auction of bonds are also being postponed because the market is not picking up those bonds and all that. That problem was not there in the somewhat more regulated regime of the 1990s. Be that as it may, the point that I mentioned earlier is that difficult to have a purely independent monetary policy, because if you believe in Walras, general equilibrium and all that, there cannot be anything independent in this economic world. All are related to each other. And I think Schumpeter wrote somewhere that you cannot move a star without moving the whole universe, something like that. If you touch monetary policy, it will have impact on, if you touch fiscal policy, it will have impact on monetary policy, it will have impact on money supply, interest rate, market prices, consumption, investment, employment, unemployment, and all these factors have to be taken into account by anybody who decides monetary policy. So this kind of complete independence is really not feasible. There will always be some gray area between management of monetary policy and fiscal policy, which includes debt management policy. I mean, that is my layman's understanding of the subject. Coming now to this impact of fiscal policy or debt management policy on the macro indicators like consumption, investment, inflation, prices, etc. Now we are hearing the expression Ricardian equivalence. Now, when I was a postgraduate student, in our history of economic analysis, 50% of the paper was allocated to Ricardo, Wicksell, and Marx. Remaining 50% was the entire history of economic analysis from the Greek days or Kautilya's days to modern days. So we had read a little bit of Ricardo. Schaffer's book had come into the market. We had not heard of Ricardian equivalence. After seeing Ricardian equivalence, I brushed up my Schumpeter copy. I still have a copy. Hardly any reference to Ricardian equivalence. Then I discovered that is the creation of Barrow and the other gentleman who wrote that article in 1974, or Buchanan. Buchanan and Barrow. These are the exponent of rational expectation school, new Keynesian theory, etc., which were not there when we studied economics. They said that taxation or incurring debt for public expenditure will have the same effect if or because the individual agents, economic agents, will have perfect foresight. They will guess how much taxes will be increased in future, and they will accordingly decide what is their consumption, what is their investment. So between taxes and debt, there is no difference. Basically, this was to disprove Keynesian theory. Incidentally, Buchanan was the chairman of what is called the Mont Pelerin Society, set up by Friedrich Hayek. I mean, I have no quarrel with them because I don't know enough economics, but they were set up to establish the superiority of what is known as the classical liberal economic theory vis-a-vis the interventionist economics of John Maynard Keynes. So they dug up some reference in Ricardo to prove this Ricardian hypothesis or Ricardian equivalence. But Ricardo himself never believed in Ricardian equivalence. I have found a reference to a book by Nancy MacLean. The book is called, no, this is not Nancy MacLean. I'll give the reference later, which deals entirely with this Ricardian equivalence and says that Ricardo himself said, if this happens, then there will be equivalence, but it is not perfect foresight, is not likely to happen. So Ricardo himself was a believer in non-equivalence. Very, very clearly, Ricardo was against accumulation of public debt. He wrote his books and articles around 1817 on this subject. Immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, France was heavily in debt, England was in debt, and if I remember correctly, public debt in England at that time definitely exceeded 100% of GDP. Probably it was some point of time twice the GDP. So Ricardo was very keen on reducing the debt burden, and he was also a member of parliament. Incidentally, he made a lot of money in the bond market. He became a landowner. He became a member of parliament. And he saw the behavior of the member of parliament in England those days. If he had seen our members of parliament, he might have had the same view. He said that these people all waste government money. If you have sinking fund for public debt redemption, they will take out that money and spend it on some useless public expenditure. So reduce debt, but don't create a sinking fund. They will have an eye on that. You have a heavy taxation, and clear this debt. And after that, try to minimize your debt, try to live within your means, etc., etc. In any case, I'll leave Ricardo for the moment and say that domestic debt has been a major concern, not only in England and France, but in our country like India, from the 80s onwards at least. Incidentally, I was reading some Indian political thought or economic thought history, not merely Kautilya, but Shukraniti. In Shukraniti, the advice to the king is that you must save 1/6 of your revenue and create a reserve fund. Now, reserve fund is gone. Debt in most of the countries now exceeds 40%, 50%, 60%. Some countries, some period of time, 100%. So this has been a concern here. And in India also, recently, the NK Singh Committee review of the FRBM Act, he has suggested that our debt GDP ratio should be brought down from 69% to 60% within next 4 or 5 years or something. I saw some other IMF recommendation, a little older, which says that developed countries may afford to have just 60%, the outer limit, but developing or emerging countries should try to bring down their debt to debt GDP ratio to 40%. Of course, there is no rule under which there is no maximization rule that there is a function, you maximize it and comes to value of 60 or 40 or something. But it is some average based upon past experience and all that. If you exceed 60%, you are in trouble. If you are a developing country with a low tax base, if you exceed 40%, you are in trouble. There is no mathematical formula for deciding what is optimum level of tax GDP ratio. But by and large, 60%, and N.K. Singh has said you try to achieve that. Maybe next review committee will say, try to reduce it further to 50%, something like that. Now, insofar as this effect of debt on consumption, investment, prices, unemployment, employment, there are a lot of studies, and most of the studies results which I have seen, including article by, I forget his name, Balakrishnan, something, probably, there's another lady who has recently written a book, Lekha Chakrabarti, from the NIPFP. Which was reviewed in the EPW more or less at the same time when Dr. Charan Singh published his article about reducing interest burden. This this review was by Surajit Das. He is of GNU, or Lekha Chakrabarti is from NIPFP, and of course Dr. Charan Singh is from IIM, Reserve Bank, etc., etc. They do not find very much evidence regarding the impact of debt on consumption, on prices, on growth. But I saw, again, some other article prepared by the Government of India. They prepared a status report on debt, where I think there's reference to positive correlation between public debt and growth up to a certain point, but after that it started going down. In any case, whether this econometric analysis shows the results of this correlation or not, the fact is that if your debt is too high, the Moody's nowadays, who does all this country rating and all that, they will give you a non-investment grade rating. In the open economy, the FDI, FPI will start going out and all that. The opposition will shout at the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, "Kya ho gaya? Achhe din nahi aaya, money is going out," and all that. So every country is quite concerned about high level of debt. So how we should, N.K. Singh has given a suggestion, you should reduce it. How we should reduce it, etc., is matter for further discussion. I would like to take 2 more minutes about this subnational debt. I have already mentioned earlier that those days when I was the finance secretary, Government of India will say your allocation for bond market raising of funds is say 500 crores. And the Reserve Bank of India would phone me one day, "Sir, we are issuing the Karnataka government bonds. Please phone Chairman Canara Bank, Syndicate Bank." Chiranjeev also must have received some phone calls like this. I don't know, by that time things might have been different. So they used to pick up our bonds. But now, as I mentioned earlier, I find the bonds are being auctioned. Probably, I'm not very sure what is the current status. These state government bonds are also being assessed by the credit rating agencies, so that while one state government bond may give a yield of 8%, another state government bond can give a yield of 9% or 10% or something. And some state governments which do not manage their fiscal affairs very carefully, they may have problem in getting their bonds lifted by the market. The latest I saw was that existing state government bond holding by the banks will be subject to, again, market evaluation, what we call mark-to-market evaluation. And that will mean that earlier there was some fixed formula for the valuation of state government bonds linked with GSEC. It will no longer be so. So suddenly the banks will find that what they consider to be worth 1 billion rupees has suddenly depreciated to 1 billion is how much? 100 crores. It has gone down to 100 crores. 1,000 crores, 1 billion. 100 crores. What they thought 100 crores has now been reduced to 80 crores. So their NPA will go up, their provisioning will go up. Again, that will have effect on market. Money will not be available. There will be real crowding out or whatever you call it. So this will also create further problem. So I would like the House and the panelists to throw some light on this subject. Thank you very much.
Raghunath, and I must also thank Professor Charan Singh for inviting me here for a discussion on a field which I was a bit hesitant about, particularly when you're coming after two heavyweights, one who has been making monetary policy both at the national and the global level for 40 years, and the other who has been during the same time, at various points at the same time, been actually implementing that policy, whether with the Provident Fund or with any other element within that. But when you come after heavyweights, that makes you a bit lightheaded. So you begin to think that you can get into issues that you should normally stay out of. And the issue that I'm going to try to address today with Professor Raghunath's permission is to really look at the question that was raised by Professor Bhalla, and which was that why do economists, monetary economists, people who have contributed substantially to monetary economics, completely change their perspective regarding an independent monetary policy when they enter the RBI. And I think that process requires us to understand a little bit about the formulation of policy and the implementation of policy. In India, as I believe in large parts of the world, the formulation of policy when it comes to experts is typically done in what one can call an engineering fashion. That is, you assume that whatever exists can be wiped off, and you can create a new ideal and construct it. It's like an engineer goes down, I happened to be in IIM when this campus was built. It was it was agricultural land, it had other constructions, but without a thought that those constructions were removed and a new campus built on it. That's the kind of conception in many ways that economists tend to have. We start off with a completely blank sheet of paper and then work out an ideal argument and then take that ideal argument into reality. It gets battered around, but still we say, okay, that's the ideal. What to do? It's either politicians or somebody. We can always find our favorite person to blame. But if we look at it from outside, from the pact of policy, then it's very obvious that the idea of an independent monetary policy is itself quite flawed. Quite simply because there's nothing that can be completely independent. I think even if you look at classical economics literature on monetary policy and the independence from debt management and the need to keep it separate, that whole argument continues right until the 2008 crisis. Once you have the 2008 crisis, when it's time for you to pick up whatever weapons you can to target the crisis, at that point, all these divisions fall apart. You begin to look at it in terms of finding whatever weapons you have and the tools that you can intervene with in debt management have to be consistent with your monetary policy. So immediately the idea of keeping them completely separate begins to erode. In fact, if we can look at it in a larger framework, from the 2008 crisis itself, you'll see the interconnections in a way that are much, much wider. For instance, the 2008 crisis might have started as a subprime crisis in the bank, prompted by the banking processes in the United States. But once the crisis was in full bloom, as it were, you ended up in India trying to respond to the lack of demand by stepping up your fiscal deficit and so on and so forth. You went forward with it, and the links were very, very clear. So it's a debt management problem which emerged here from a banking crisis somewhere else. And you find these processes are deeply interlinked. In fact, you could go further and say it's not just a matter of official policies in different places. It's a general environment. Today, it's fashionable to bash the RBI and to bash anything that's independent and within the country. But we tend to forget that in the 70s, at a time when the rest of the world was advised to have a free market as far as the flow of foreign funds was concerned, India and the RBI took a position that was different. And we could argue about that for very long, but essentially the fact remains that when the Latin American countries fell into a debt trap, India did not. And you have to give credit where it's due. You have to recognize that the RBI did play a role in maintaining that independence. So you have these connections, and one can go on about it. Like the GST now is facing serious trouble in generating the revenues it should be generating, or it was economists expected it to generate, is probably a more accurate description. And that will have its impact on the fiscal deficit, whether we like to, how we sort of cover it up is a different matter, but it will have impact on fiscal deficit, and possibly, I would say very likely, on public debt. It's going to emerge from it. So the point one is making is, and we can go on in the Indian context with the fact that you're moving from an unorganized sector to an organized sector means your provident funds are going to go up, and if provident funds go up, that is a part of public debt, which you have to take into account when you're making monetary policy, or you have to come to terms with the very nature of the fact that a part of your public policy has got to deal with the nationalized banks who are in a mess. And when they decide, as they have done recently, to hand over IDBI or get LIC to invest public funds in, or deposits or whatever premiums that have been paid into IDBI, a bank that is clearly facing great difficulty, you're once again linking up a large number of issues which won't even come under the official category of public debt, but nevertheless is a fact of government spending or government resources that are being diverted. So, as I said, if it's all so interconnected, what the problem is, how do I deal with independence, right? And because there's no doubt that if I allow this kind of complete freedom, when it's saying it's all interconnected, so what does it matter, who does what, you're going to face all kinds of challenges which are being posed by people who are taking policy decisions without any scrutiny. The idea of the LIC taking over IDBI Bank comes up much later. There's really no economic analysis of why that should be the way forward, other than the fact that it's convenient for a government that's already facing fiscal pressures from various directions. So one would try to argue that the way out is really to go back to the starting point, and that economic policy in India is largely done through many parts of the world is largely done through an engineering mindset. You're looking for an ideal construct, you put it onto an architect's kind of a drawing board, and then bring it and impose it on things. The assumption is that you can forget what is happening on the ground, or you can ensure it is forgotten. If need be, you can erase whatever is there and reconstruct it. But in reality, we find that there are too many factors to allow you to do that. It's not just like in a developed world where you have established systems, you can say you take care of this and somebody else takes care of that and you get a certain amount of independence built in. It's a set that too many things are continuously changing. You're moving from, as I said, from the informal sector to the formal sector, at least hopefully. We are moving from agriculture to non-agriculture. You're moving from the rural to the urban. And as you try to work out all these dynamics, any rigid formulation would not work. What you need to do instead is to go back, I think, to the conception of the old-fashioned doctors, who used to see a patient who's obviously a living patient, and who do not have the option, at least not until now, of actually killing a patient and starting afresh. Right? You have a patient, you try to do what you can, you recognize that your interventions will have side effects, you get into it. The fact then is you function with a certain degree of autonomy. You try to ensure your medicines do not have other side effects. This is something that is an approach that economists, there was a time when it was taken in a limited sense back to the classics and physiocrats, etc., but I won't go back to the past in front of Mr. Bhattacharya. But essentially, the fact of the matter is that you have these very clear specific elements where you intervene in a process. You recognize the economy as a living process. You recognize the fact that there will be pressure on the government to use LIC funds to take over IDBI. Even if it's undesirable, it's like an undesirable side effect or undesirable set of symptoms that are emerging in the economy. How do I intervene at that point? At that point, to say I'm going to go in for inflation targeting is extremely over-focused. Because there will be periods when you say I'm going inflation targeting, then you identify the specific tools you're going to use for that, the specific remedies, medicines you're going to do. And as Professor Bhalla pointed out, they don't always work. The fiscal deficit, we were all brought up to think that any expansion on fiscal deficit will be immediately inflationary. And there was a time when it may have been, but clearly over the last decade and more, it has not been inflationary, and there's no clear relationship, as Professor Bhalla said. So really, the issue really then is that how do you intervene? How do you recognize the side effects? You must then make a distinction between the autonomy of what you're doing and complete independence. You cannot take actions because they work in an ideal situation, irrespective of whether they kill the patient. And in that sense, any talk about an independent monetary policy must be tempered, at least, by the processes of debt that are there. And we have just finished a fairly substantial large sample survey of rural debt in Karnataka. And you find astonishing kind of patterns emerging, including the fact of a clear preference for the informal over the formal, including the fact that the informal is developing instruments that the formal cannot hope to match. They have systems there which Chiranjeev Singh would know, the idea of a cheaty, where essentially it is an instrument that can at the last moment be changed from a saving instrument into an insurance instrument. These are instruments that the formal sector just cannot match, right? And you're going to deal with that kind of a real life situation, and you're intervening there, right? It's very easy for people like me who are economists and trained in economics to say that this is what you should do, and if something goes wrong, there are enough people to point fingers at. But ultimately, I think we need to move from what I would call an engineering mindset to a diagnostic mindset. And then see the extent. You certainly need autonomy. You need to trust your doctors. Your doctors need to have the autonomy to function with it. But ultimately, they cannot be insensitive to side effects. They cannot assume that things are not interconnected. Thank you. Now, I was just wondering, over the last 4 decades, what would you agree that the autonomy of the RBI has tended to go up and down? It's not been flat? Or would you say that by and large it has had a considerable degree of autonomy and one that it has managed to safeguard over the years?
Yeah. So the first part of the question is, over the last 4 or 5 decades, has there been autonomy within the central bank or between the central bank? Absolutely. Though formally the central bank is not independent, de facto, and clearly I would say from the mid-90s, it has acted like an independent central bank. So that's 25 years or 22 years. And all the central bank governors have been quite dominant, there have been debates or disagreements with the Ministry of Finance, but the central bank has won out. I'm not saying they made the right decisions, so I think by and large, they did. But, you know, this whole, I've been intrigued by this whole debate on the independence of the central bank, which came to the fore with the MPC and setting them up as a inflation targeting institution. You know, if you look at the inflation today, and even as much as about 10 or, I'll leave you with the following statistic, that the nature of inflation has changed, and monetary and targeting, inflation targeting, etc., still believes that the world has not changed. Take the US and Western Europe and the advanced economies, that since 1996, that's 22 years, inflation in these economies has been below 2% or thereabouts. Now, when I went to graduate school, which was some time ago in the early 1970s, one of the first lessons we were taught is that, you know, 2% inflation is frictional. That is, people moving from one job to the other. That's the maximum inflation that the Western world has had for 20 years. And before you say that, you know, right now the whole world is concerned about oil prices, that in 1998, the price of a barrel of oil was $10, and it went to $75 in 2006 and 2007, and went to $150 in 2008. But let's take from 10 to 75, world inflation actually declined with the oil price going up. So what I'm saying is the nature of the beast has changed, and independent or non-independent central bank, we need to recognize that the nature of the beast has changed.
Good evening to all the dignitaries. I'm a first-year economics honors student from Christ University. My name is Medha. Sir, I have two questions. The first question being, will financing fiscal deficit affect public debt and the public debt?
What is the after effects of?
Financing the fiscal deficit. So my first question is, will financing fiscal deficit affect public debt? And if it does, what will be the after effects on the general public?
No, look, by definition, if you have a fiscal deficit, you add to your total debt. Now, the method of financing is what the whole debate is about, as to how much do you have of short-term credit, long-term credit, domestic borrowers versus international borrowers. But, you know, it affects the fiscal deficit, and there's a whole bunch of literature on debt dynamics and growth as to when is debt sustainable or not. But on all those parameters, actually, India, as you know, it's a very non-problematic area in India. So definitionally, if you have a fiscal deficit, you're adding to the debt of the country.
Just that I think, just to reiterate a point that he had made earlier, that the assumption that economists have it will lead to inflation is not always the case, in answer to your second question. And that even if you look at it in a traditional Keynesian fashion, it will only lead to inflation when the economy does not grow. Otherwise, the additional demand that comes from that can be absorbed through production rather than inflation. So there's, as I said earlier, the important thing is to assess what the effects will be and not to try and follow too mechanical a process about it.
Is that it? Okay. You have one. I'm Kodan Ram, retired assistant director from National Academy of Customs. My question is regarding GST to the member. GST collection should have been not expected level. What was the expected level? How do you arrive at that it has not reached the expected level? And what are the intricacies or what are the problems that has not reached? Is there any expected one available and we have not reached, or we have reached but still better could be done? What is your analysis on that? I want to have a fair comment on that.
You know, one, let me just state that all the empirical evidence, and it's a 1-year anniversary of the GST, all the empirical evidence suggests that it is fantastically successful. So you're starting off with that it hasn't worked, that the targets were much higher, etc., if I understand you right. It's been fantastically successful. Okay. And look, it is on indirect taxes, the center, and one indicator that has been fantastically successful is that the center, in order to get the GST passed, the constitutional amendment passed, in my view, essentially bribed the states, gave them a 14% that they guaranteed them that regardless of the nature of the economy, that their VAT revenues will rise by 14% a year for the next 5 years. Okay, so that I'm giving you a parameter by which to assess as to how successful they've been. The center, in order to make sure that there wasn't a burden on them if they didn't achieve the target of 14%, guaranteed or imposed cess on the GST on particular items to finance the deficit that might occur. That cess was 66,000 crores for 2017-18 and is 90,000 crores for 18-19. Even in 2017-18, and the data is yet to come out fully, I think you saved a fair amount of money in the sense of, and we don't know who it goes to the center or the states. And in 2018-19, the expectation is none of the cess will be used. So this is another indicator. Indirect tax, which is assessed. So the complication, I think, has arisen because there's CGST, there's SGST, and there's IGST, and we all worried about what it does to the central deficit and what it does to the state's deficit and so on and so forth. It should be assessed on what are the total revenues from GST, no matter how calculate, who does it accrue to? It accrues to the governments of the states as well as the center. That is, in 2017-18, the first year of introduction. So you would expect there are teething problems, and there's still a lot of teething problems in terms of exporters not getting their refunds and so on and so forth. So there are problems, but the net result is the indirect tax revenue rose by about 12% when the nominal GDP rose by 10. So the buoyancy of 1.2 in indirect taxes is very unusual. Normally you get 1 to 1 or less than 1. And here to get 1, so I think unambiguously it's been a success, and history will mark it in 3-4 years as one of the biggest success stories in India. Yeah.
My question is addressed to Dr. Bhalla. I know that we have been critical of the MPC as well as the Reserve Bank of India regarding their interest rate policy. I think you would have liked them to reduce the interest rates. According to you, what should be the factors which should determine the interest rate policy? One is, of course, their so-called inflation targeting. You say that they're chasing the wrong beast or something. They're not taking into account what are the factors which is causing inflation and in which areas inflation is taking place, whereas CPI, WPI do not reflect that. So that is one thing. Secondly, at the same time, the need for ensuring that government bonds are picked up by the market, and also monetary policy becoming a slave of the fiscal policy, as somebody would say. Third, of course, is that all these retirement funds, as a provident fund, pension funds, etc. A lot of 30%, 40% it used to be. I don't know what it is now. Invested in all these government securities. So these pensioners, this provident fund, pension fund contributors, they look after the return on their investment. They grumble if they don't get 8.75% or 9% or something, whereas probably the market-driven interest rate could be probably 6% or 7% or something. So what should be a balanced view of taking into account all these factors, how the interest rate should be determined?
I'll link the two parts, the first part and the third part. I mean, basically, as you know better than most, we have had, throughout our history, a real suspicion about the market and what market determines. And profit, if you will, has been a four-letter word in India. And the corollary to that is the bureaucrat and the government knows better. So let's take your last part of your question about the EPFO and the small savings rates, this, that, whatever. We have interest rates being determined by the government, not by the monetary authorities, not by the market. The market is, after all, the actions of all the individual people. Why should the government be setting interest rates? And very equivalently, government on these things. Clearly, the central bank should be setting interest rates, but I'm talking on saving instruments that the government should have no role to play. It should be determined by whatever the interest rate should be, or is. That brings us to the first part of the question. And if you will, is very much the government setting small savings rates or administered rates or pension fund rates is like the government running Air India. Okay, they're exactly equivalent. The government doesn't belong in doing either. Now to the first part of the question, where the RBI and interest rate setting, I think my complaint has been and remains that there isn't a consistency. Central banks have to earn credibility, have to communicate, and have to have a consistent set and well advanced, in advance, to tell the market what they're doing. And the MPC has been far removed from setting up a consistent and coherent policy. I'll end with, if you read their reports just recently, there's somebody in the central bank arguing that the CPI, which is the mandated, legal headline inflation rate, as the target. And then you have a central bank governor saying, no, 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 we should have CPI excluding food, excluding fuel, excluding housing as the target. So at least let's be clear and be open as to what the target is, which is, mind you, enshrined in law. It is part of the Act. The MPC Act of the Parliament says that the headline inflation should be the target of monetary policy. And we have central bank governors on the MPC arguing that that is not the case, or that shouldn't be the case. So all I'm asking for, and all I've asked for, just be consistent. I mean, you decide. You decide that the price of peanuts is what you're going to follow. Then follow it. But do not say you're going to follow the price of peanuts and follow instead the price of potatoes.
I have a question. It's not exactly related to this, but a very contemporary interest. We have the farm loans waiver. Since Bhattacharya managed the finance portfolio for nearly 6 years eminently, maybe he can tell us what effect this will have, the farm loan waiver, because it was very easily said we'll waive the farm loans and we will have to do it. and what effect it will have?
Before I try to give my own reply, because nowadays I don't really apply my mind too much to many of these financial issues and all that. When you feel that it is a major issue today, then you take a philosophical view that after 2 years, the economy will take care of it and things will again settle down and all that. So I'll come to my own perception a little later. But I remember my batchmate and friend Venugopal Reddy, former governor of the RBI, was recently here at our IAS association for releasing his book. There the same question was raised to Venugopal. So his reply was, find out in the villages who are the people who are getting loans from the, and I think his reply was not a facetious reply, it was a serious reply. I think. Who gets the loan from the cooperative societies or the banks? What percentage of people, what is their ownership pattern, what is their economic standing and all that? And who decides to become defaulters? I mean, that is more or less the word he used. Then you will know who will be the beneficiaries of the loan waiver scheme. Then you draw your conclusion whether it is a desirable scheme or not. That is what his reply was. Now, my reply would be a little more moderate probably. I'm not given to extreme views because I believe I don't know any subject in depth. So it will be superficial reply that if the benefit is given to smallholders, but I think they are now talking of some 5 acres or something, and if the amount that arrives and that is arrived at finally, so instead of 30,000 crore, which is a big amount for a state government budget, if they can bring it down to maybe 15, 20,000 crore, then cut a little bit of wastage. There's a lot of wastage. I mean, I agree with whether it is Ricardo or somebody that I've handled finance for 5 years almost. There's a lot of wastage in government. There is a lot of what somebody has written a book. Now here, I believe, in England also a book has been written with the same title, The Cost of Democracy. What is the cost of democracy? That certain wastage has to be there. So that democracy can function in a well-oiled manner. So if you can reduce some of those wastages and all that, probably a farm loan waiver for a really small marginal farmers, if you can keep it within some limit of 15, 20, 25,000 crores, cutting some wastages here and there, maybe increase a little taxation here and there, it should be manageable. But whether that will happen that way, or there will be pressure to give much larger concession, some of the large, at one time, I won't mention any relationship or anything, some planters, we have large planters in Karnataka, they are also looking for what, Kab Milega, loan waiver and things like that. That should not happen. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. I just have a small question. Actually, like talking on the present situation of fuel prices, which have risen, and at the same time, concurrently, we see that the value of currency has fallen down. So if these two are happening at the same time, could you please throw a little light over what would be the financial risks with which Indian economy would face, and what would be the probable mitigative strategies which the government would have to take?
Government questions. The echo. Is on the list, the decline in the rupee as well as the rise of fuel prices. Both are interlinked.
Decline in the rupee as well as
the rise in fuel prices independently, both together, the impact on the economy.
You know, the facts are as follows, that let's take the decline of the rupee, that the Indian rupee has performed rather well in terms of comparison. After all, we are not all the comparisons are with respect to the US dollar. And what has happened is that the US dollar has appreciated versus every currency in the world. So where do we stand in that? and we are standing very, very, I think the rupee is down about 5.5%, 6%, and there are several other currencies well above. China is the only one which has depreciated by about something like 3% or so. But after that, 4, 5, 6% and well above is a given. So we have performed rather well. As comparison, remember the taper tantrum in 2013 when the dollar had a similar rise. And that time, India was the worst performing currency in terms of that we depreciated the most, something like 12, 13%, when the average was about 5, 6. So as far as the present episode is concerned, this has nothing to do, this has to do with the strength of the dollar and the trade wars and how the markets have reacted to it. Then we come to the fuel price. And, you know, there is a mechanical transmission of the fuel price onto higher inflation. But it is well recognized, in most parts of the world it is recognized, except, again, coming back to your earlier question. You know, central banks around the world exclude food and fuel from their estimation of inflation. Because food and fuel are volatile, something monetary policy can do little about. I mean, what can monetary policy do about Saudi Arabia and OPEC raising prices? Very little. But what is peculiar about the Indian situation is that the price of petrol, gasoline, is not part of fuel. Fuel is electricity and LPG cylinders and electricity. Okay. So I have been arguing in many of these that we should, you know, formally define our core inflation as that excluding food and fuel and oil, petrol, for the simple reason that monetary policy should not be expected to control the price of OPEC. So therefore, the question has to do with the second round effects of oil on inflation, okay? On core inflation, if you will. And the second round effects of oil on core inflation are very, very small. And that is why I gave the example earlier that between 98 and 2007, oil prices went up 7 times and did not have any effect on inflation. Either, or let's take India, since your question pertains to India. Between 98 to 2004, average Indian inflation, when the oil price went up from $10 to $50, average price of, the average inflation rate in India was 4.2%, and that includes the 9% onion inflation in 99. So these are, you know, not myths, but don't confuse me with facts. My mind is made up type of assertions. Oil price has gone up? Absolutely. Then you observe something else goes up, is a correlation versus causation. Acha, this must have caused this. When you start investigating, you find a different answer.
Thank you, sir.
May I ask one more question? Yesterday, I was watching on the YouTube MSCNBC or something. Somebody showed Donald Trump fulminating at one point before the election. Now our debt has touched 19 trillion. I'm sure soon it will touch 21 trillion, and the economy is going to dogs and things like that. And they say yesterday, the Central Budget Office has announced that the debt had touched 21 billion after the trillion under the watch of Donald Trump. That is one thing I saw. And the commentator, probably some exaggeration, I don't know whether CBO predicted or he's predicted, at this rate, by 2030, US debt will exceed 100% of the US GDP. Maybe an exaggeration, whatever it is. Simultaneously, a few days back, I was rereading some parts of the book by the author whom you do not like very much, Mr. Piketty. Mr. Piketty talks about huge debt incurred by Britain, France, etc., etc. Then he says, in most cases, these debts are finally cleared by huge inflation and all that. Most of the bonds that you hold ultimately become worth 1/4 or 1/5 of the price. I'm asking an atrocious question. Do you think USA will have something like that? Only an inflation will be able to solve their problem if their debt exceeds more than 100% of their GDP, as was predicted yesterday.
Very quickly, you're asking the wrong person, because I have just written a few articles and made presentations that inflation is dead, as I just said. Let's look at now in terms of your debt dynamics and inflation and how to get out of it. Japan, to the best of my knowledge, their debt to GDP ratio is upwards of 200 or 300%. Japan. And the inflation rate is continuously going down. They're fighting very, very hard. I mean, look, debt has gone up, the oil has gone up, this, that, and it's globalization, I think, that has kept prices down. That's the big change. So for Mr. Piketty or whoever to argue about these old-fashioned hypotheses, दुनिया बदल गई सर, हम कब बदलेंगे?
If USA walks out of WTO and this globalization goes haywire, तो क्या होगा?
It's impossible. I will say this. It's impossible for globalization to go haywire. It's too far gone. Gaddi has left the station a long time ago. Maybe you can.
So just as a clarification, if you make a distinction between globalization declining and globalization going haywire, they're two very different things. It's very possible that globalization can go haywire in the sense that it gets out of control, it gets highly skewed, and we're already seeing signs of that some countries are getting a certain benefit of it. And it's not the traditional developed versus developing kind of mark. I mean, China's growth path over the last 4 decades or 3 decades as compared to India's, I think shows that the fact that there's globalization or the fact that there are common patterns emerging globally does not mean that the benefits will be equal or uniform.
Okay, yeah.
And
and this,
how do we respond to that?
It's back in, and sorry to quote, but I need to quote in order to make this point. In 2002, when I wrote my book, Imagine There's No Country, there's a long paragraph in there. And in there I state, isn't it funny or isn't it interesting that when these anti-globalization protests are there against the World Bank and the IMF and all the WTO and all the rest of it, you don't find any brown person in there, you don't find any black person in there, you don't find any yellow person in there. You only find white people. What has happened with globalization and what Trump has responded to is that the advanced countries have lost out. We, the developing countries, have gained enormously. We want to look at the poverty rate, you want to look at the middle class rate. I'll tell you the rate you should look at. And this estimate has been presented. Let us take, we are talking about globalization is not whether US benefits or India benefits, it's whether the world benefits. World inequality today is back to the levels it was in 1870 and is on the path to be the lowest ever in the next 2-3 years, regardless of what Mr. Trump does. Indeed, Trump is reacting to the fact that global inequality has gone down. Global inequality goes down when American incomes don't go as fast as somebody else's incomes. That's the problem. The problem is precisely that the Western world has stopped growing.
So just for the sake of argument, if that can...
Growing, by stop growing, meaning 1.5%.
Yeah. If you can, suppose, how would you react to the argument that global inequality has gone down only if you see it in terms of country averages.
No, individual averages, individual citizen averages.
Individual citizen, if you look at it, there are estimates which show it's gone up substantially. I'm not talking about
No, no, 1 second. No, no. I will ask you the following. Okay, I've heard this. I've seen this movie many times before. Look, let me just give you the simplest statistic in the world, and you can give it to Mr. Piketty, and you can give it to whoever. Between 1980 and now, per capita income in India and China alone, which accounts for something like 40% of the world's population, per capita income in India and China has grown at 6% or 6.5% per annum. Western world, so think of just two countries. Western world, they are here in terms of income. We are here in terms of income. We grow at 6.5% a year, so we are here. Those guys are there only. By any, it's the simplest logic in the world. Inequality has gone down.
I'll just respond to that by, just to take the debate forward.
Yeah.
It's just that suppose I have an increase in inequality within India, which has happened. You have a couple of people up in the top 100 richest people in the world, a few of them right there. The per capita income for the country as a whole then becomes an average over very vast inequalities. And you've seen the fact that China's inequality within China has grown, within India has grown, is something that is established, whether we use expenditure or income data. So the issue really is, have we at some point ended up sort of absorbing the inequalities, what used to be global inequalities, have we begun to absorb them within countries? And you're seeing it in the sense of, if you look at labor patterns, the circular migration that's emerging from Bihar, the idea of, say, since we're talking about popular statistics, 10 to 15 years ago, there was no question of getting housemaids from Bengal in Bangalore. It's today a very common pattern. You're getting evidence of that kind, and we do a little bit of measurement of inequality, and we found that certainly within the country, it has increased. So at some point, have we moved from inter-country inequality, where you make the very valid point that globalization, and Trump is responding to that, but have we moved from an increased inequality decreasing inequality between countries to increasing inequality within countries? And Trump is responding to that as well.
Okay. Very, very, good question. And the nice thing about globalization today is that we don't debate in a vacuum anymore. You can take out your little gadget and you can easily find out the answers. And this is something I've devoted a lot of time to and attention to. And the facts are as follows. First, let's take India. Inequality in India, we only have the NSSO consumption data, and from 1983 to 2011-12, we are going to get the new consumption data sometime in the next 6 months or so. But let's take that 30-year period. During those 30 years, real inequality in India, the Gini coefficient, went something from 0.3034 to 0.3135. I consider that as no change. Now, let us look at let us take out China, and the reason I'm taking out China, Russia, Cambodia, Laos, and a few other economies, maybe a couple of others, that have gone through a massive structural change from socialism to capitalism, whatever you may call it. Every region in the world, and within that, almost every country in the world, outside of the Western world, I'll come to the Western world in a minute, has shown a decline in inequality. Brazil, from a Gini of 0.62 to a Gini of 0.58. But the point is, your question is about the change, not the level, okay, of individual countries. US has shown an increase in inequality, and the largest increase ever. Today, the Gini coefficient in the US is the largest it has ever experienced. However, coming back to Mr. Piketty, he claims that the top 1% has gained income share from something like 9-10% in 1980-81 to something like 22-23% today. That's the basis of his. Now there are studies coming out from the US, from US academics, that maybe Piketty exaggerated just a little bit, that the increase from 9-10% is actually only till 12 or 13%. Inequality has gone up in the US, but it's nowhere close. This is, you know, this is a very emotive issue, and I think, you know, rightly, I mean, Trump couldn't give a damn about what's happening in other countries. I'm quite confident. He is responding to his voter base, and his voter base has lost out to the people sitting around here, to the people sitting in China, to the people sitting in Korea and everywhere else. They've lost out. I'll end on the following. If you are just and this is just a plug-in for my book, The New Wealth of Nations. The data is contained there. In the US, if you were only a high school graduate, okay, between 1980 and now, you've seen your real incomes decline by 10 percentage points. Okay? That's his vote base, just a high school graduate. If you went to college but did not graduate, you have seen your real income stay constant. When between 1960 and 1980, you saw large increases. So these are the guys waking up one day, no change in income for 30 years. Can you just imagine what that does? And if you're a college graduate, the creme de la creme, you've seen your real income from 1980 to 1996 rise by 1 percentage point per annum, and from 96 onwards, rise by 0.5 percentage points per annum. That's what Trump is responding to. In the US, and I'm not even mentioning Germany, no matter where you look in the Western world, this is real wages haven't gone up, going up. Well, haven't gone up, I mean by, maybe gone up by 1 percentage point a year.